Hey guys, tonight we're leaving behind the noise of the modern world and traveling thousands of years into the past. So relax, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift across the endless golden deserts beside the Great Nile River. Tonight, we enter the mysterious world of ancient Egypt, a land of massive pyramids, silent temples, powerful pharaohs, and royal families whose secrets remained buried beneath the sands for thousands of years. When we think about ancient Egypt, we usually imagine golden treasures, magnificent palaces, and rulers who looked almost like gods. And in a way, that is exactly how the Egyptians saw them. The pharaoh was not simply a king, he was believed to be a living connection between humans and the gods. He controlled the land, commanded armies, and was responsible for keeping order throughout the entire kingdom. That is a very heavy responsibility for one person. Imagine waking up every morning knowing you must rule a great civilization, solve political problems, satisfy priests, and somehow maintain the balance of the universe. No pressure at all. But behind the perfect stone statues and golden crowns was a different reality. The pharaohs were human beings. They experienced fear, illness, loneliness, and the burden of endless expectations. One of the strangest traditions of the Egyptian royal family was their practice of marrying close relatives. Many pharaohs married their sisters or other family members because they believed royal blood was sacred and connected to the gods. To modern people, this seems unusual and difficult to understand, but for the ancient royal family, it was a symbol of divine power. Unfortunately, keeping the bloodline so limited sometimes created health problems that affected future generations. Perhaps the most famous example is the young king Tutankhamun. Today, the world remembers his beautiful golden mask and the incredible treasures discovered inside his tomb. The mask showed a powerful and eternal ruler, but the young person behind that mask lived a much more fragile life. Tutankhamun became pharaoh when he was only a child. Imagine being a young boy and suddenly being told that an entire kingdom now depends on you. Most children worry about games and daily lessons. Tutankhamun had the weight of an empire placed on his shoulders. His advisors helped control many of the important decisions of the kingdom. Modern studies of his remains suggest he had physical problems and may have struggled to walk comfortably. Inside his tomb, many walking sticks were discovered, a quiet reminder that behind the image of a perfect god was a young human being dealing with his own struggles. This is perhaps the greatest secret of ancient Egypt. The statues show us perfection. History shows us humanity. The ancient Egyptians were also deeply fascinated with what happened after death. They believed death was not the end of existence. Instead, it was the beginning of another journey. Because of this belief, they spent enormous amounts of time preparing for the afterlife. Pharaohs built magnificent tombs filled with jewelry, furniture, clothing, and treasures that they believed would help them in the next world. It was almost like preparing a palace for an eternal journey. Of course, the owner would not move in until after death. The Egyptians developed the incredible process known as mummification. This complex ritual could take many weeks. The body was carefully preserved using natural materials, wrapped in linen, and protected through religious ceremonies. The heart was usually left inside the body because Egyptians believed it contained a person's emotions, memories, and intelligence. The brain, however, was considered much less important, a rather unfortunate opinion for the organ that had spent an entire lifetime doing all the thinking. Ancient beliefs can sometimes be very surprising. Another mystery that continues to amaze the modern world is the construction of the pyramids. These giant structures were built as monuments that would survive long after the pharaohs were gone. Every ruler understood that one day their body would disappear, their palace would become ruins, and their voice would become silent. So they created something that could speak for them forever. Great mountains of stone standing proudly in the desert. A message to future generations saying, "I lived, I ruled, remember me." And thousands of years later, we still do. But these treasures also brought danger. Many tombs attracted thieves who searched for gold and valuable objects. Imagine spending years creating the perfect home for eternity, only for someone to enter and say, "This looks expensive, I think I will take it." Some parts of human nature never truly change. Power, wealth, ambition, and greed have existed in every civilization. Ancient Egypt was no different. Behind every beautiful temple was a story of politics. Behind every royal marriage was a struggle for power. And behind every golden mask was a person with hopes, fears, and weaknesses. The greatest pharaohs tried to become immortal, but the reason we still remember them today is not because they were perfect, it is because they were human. Their stories continue to whisper through the ancient sands of the Nile, waiting for someone to listen. And tonight, our journey into the dark secrets of ancient Egypt has only just begun. As our journey continues deeper into ancient Egypt, the stories become even more complicated. Because this was not only a land of pyramids and pharaohs, it was also a place where power was fragile, ambition was dangerous, and even the royal family could become a battlefield. Behind the golden walls of the palace, one question quietly shaped the future of Egypt. Who truly holds power when the pharaoh is weak? In many cases, the answer was not the king himself, but the people standing just behind him, the priests, the advisors, and sometimes the queens. In ancient Egypt, royal women were not always silent figures in the background. Some of them were powerful, intelligent, and politically skilled enough to influence entire kingdoms. One of the most remarkable examples of this hidden power comes from a queen named Hatshepsut. At first, she was not meant to rule Egypt. She was meant to support the throne, marry a pharaoh, and remain in the traditional role expected of royal women. But history rarely follows expectations. When the male heir to the throne was too young to rule, Hatshepsut stepped forward as regent. At first, she governed in his name, but over time, something unusual began to happen. She did not step back when the young king grew older. Instead, she stepped forward even further, and eventually she declared herself pharaoh, not queen, not regent, but king of Egypt. To strengthen her authority, she even adopted the symbols of male pharaohs in statues and carvings, a beard that was not natural, a posture designed to represent traditional kingship. It was not deception, it was survival. Because in the world she lived in, power often required reinvention. Under her rule, Egypt experienced a period of stability and prosperity. Temples were built, trade expanded, and the kingdom flourished quietly under a ruler who was never meant to sit on the throne. But after her death, something equally fascinating happened too. Her legacy was slowly erased. Monuments were defaced. Her name was removed from records, as if someone tried to rewrite history itself. Even today, historians still debate why this happened. Was it revenge, political correction, or simply an attempt by later rulers to restore traditional order? Ancient Egypt rarely leaves clear answers. Instead, it leaves shadows. And those shadows are often where the most interesting stories hide. But Hatshepsut was not the only figure who challenged expectations. Egyptian history is filled with rulers who blurred the line between myth and reality. Some pharaohs tried to reshape religion itself. Others attempted to centralize all divine power under their control. And in doing so, they often created conflict with the powerful priesthood that controlled temples and rituals across the land. Because in Egypt, religion was not separate from politics. It was politics. The temples were not just places of worship, they were centers of influence, wealth, and authority. And whoever controlled the gods often controlled the people. This constant struggle between throne and temple created a silent tension that ran through centuries of Egyptian history, a tension that could elevate a ruler to greatness or erase them from memory entirely. And as we move further into this ancient world, we begin to realize something important. The secrets of Egypt are not only buried in tombs and pyramids, they are also buried in power struggles, in forgotten names, in rewritten stories, and in the silent decisions made behind closed doors of stone palaces. But our journey is still far from over, because beyond queens who became kings and kings who feared their own priests, there are even darker and more mysterious chapters waiting ahead. Stories of cursed tombs, lost revolutions, and pharaohs who tried to defy death itself. So as the desert wind continues to move over forgotten sands, we step forward once again into the deeper secrets of ancient Egypt. As we go deeper into ancient Egypt, the story begins to feel less like history and more like something whispered. Because here, death was not the end. It was a transition, a dangerous journey into another world filled with judgment, spirits, and uncertainty. The ancient Egyptians believed that life did not stop when the body stopped breathing. Instead, the soul continued forward into the afterlife, where it would be judged by the gods. And because of this belief, death was treated with a level of seriousness that shaped almost everything they built, especially the tombs. For the pharaohs, a tomb was not just a resting place, it was an eternal home, a carefully designed gateway into immortality. Inside these tombs, everything was prepared as if the king would wake up again tomorrow. Food, jewelry, furniture, statues, even servants were sometimes symbolically included to serve in the afterlife. The goal was simple: to continue life forever, without interruption. This is why the pyramids were built with such precision, gigantic stone structures aligned with astronomical accuracy, designed to protect the body of the ruler for eternity. But the more effort they put into protecting death, the more fear seemed to grow around it. Over time, stories began to spread among workers, priests, and later generations. Stories about disturbances, strange events, and the idea that some tombs were not meant to be disturbed. One of the most famous modern examples of this fear comes from the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb. When archaeologists uncovered the sealed chamber, it felt like stepping into a moment frozen in time. Everything inside was untouched for thousands of years, and that discovery shocked the world. But soon after, something even more fascinating happened. A series of unexpected deaths among people connected to the excavation began to spread rumors. Newspapers called it a curse, the curse of the pharaohs. Suddenly, science and superstition collided. Some believed the tomb carried ancient protection spells meant to punish intruders. Others insisted it was coincidence, bad timing, or natural causes exaggerated by fear and media attention. But regardless of the explanation, the idea of a curse captured global imagination because it fit perfectly with what people already felt about Egypt, a civilization so advanced, so mysterious, so deeply connected to death that it almost felt unreal. But beyond the myths, the truth is more human. Tombs were protected not by magic, but by belief. Inscriptions warned against disturbing the dead not because of supernatural power, but because the Egyptians believed in justice after death. To violate a tomb was to disrupt cosmic order, and cosmic order was the foundation of their entire worldview. Still, the fear remained. And fear has a way of surviving longer than facts. As centuries passed, the pyramids became silent monuments of that fear and ambition, gigantic reminders of a civilization that tried to outlast time itself. The time, as always, continued moving forward. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, cities disappeared into sand, and Egypt itself transformed into something new. Yet the pyramids still stood, watching, waiting, reminding the world that something once existed here that refused to be forgotten. And as we move closer to the final chapters of this journey, one question begins to rise above all others. Was ancient Egypt truly obsessed with death? Or were they simply more honest about it than we are today? Because in the end, every civilization must face the same truth. No matter how powerful, no matter how rich, no matter how divine it believes itself to be, time always wins. And even the pharaohs, who once believed they could escape it, now exist only in stories carved into stone. But our journey is not finished yet. Because beyond the tombs and curses, there are still deeper mysteries waiting beneath the desert sands. Secrets of lost cities, forgotten gods, and the final fate of a civilization that once believed it could never end. As we move deeper into the final chapters of ancient Egypt, the tone of the story begins to change. What once felt like a powerful, eternal civilization slowly starts to feel fragile, because even the greatest empires in human history eventually reach a point where their foundations begin to crack. And Egypt was no exception. For thousands of years, ancient Egypt had been held together by something incredibly strong. Not just armies, not just kings, but belief. Belief in the gods, belief in the pharaoh, and belief that the world itself was stable and unchanging. But over time, that belief began to shift. Because Egypt was not isolated. It was constantly interacting with neighboring civilizations, trading, fighting, and absorbing outside influences. And with every new contact, new ideas began to enter the land of the Nile. New gods, new cultures, new ways of thinking, and slowly the old order began to lose its absolute authority. One of the most dramatic moments in this shift came during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten. He did something that shocked the entire religious system of Egypt. He challenged the traditional gods. For centuries, Egypt had worshipped a vast pantheon of deities, but Akhenaten pushed forward a radical idea that there was only one true god, the Aten, the sun disk. At first, this may sound like a simple religious reform, but in reality, it was a complete revolution, because by changing religion, Akhenaten was also changing power. The priests who controlled temples lost influence, old rituals were abandoned, temples were closed, and a new capital city was built to reflect this new belief system. Everything about Egypt was being reshaped around a single idea. But revolutions rarely come without consequences. After Akhenaten's death, the old religious system quickly returned. Temples were reopened, the old gods restored, and Akhenaten himself was almost erased from official memory. His reign became one of the most mysterious and controversial periods in Egyptian history, a reminder that even the most powerful rulers cannot easily rewrite thousands of years of tradition. But the weakening of internal unity was only part of Egypt's decline. Outside forces were growing stronger: Assyrians, Persians, and later the Greeks. Each empire arrived with greater military strength and more advanced political systems. One by one, Egypt lost control over its own land. And yet, even in decline, it remained deeply respected, because Egypt was not just another kingdom, it was a symbol of ancient wisdom, mystery, and endurance. Eventually, in 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt and was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Later, the Ptolemaic Prunsti would rule Egypt, blending Greek and Egyptian culture together in a final attempt to preserve its identity. And among its most famous rulers was Cleopatra VII, a queen remembered not only for her political intelligence, but also for her role in the final collapse of independent Egypt. With her death, ancient Egypt as a sovereign civilization effectively came to an end. But something interesting happened after that. Egypt did not disappear. It transformed. Its gods were forgotten or merged into new belief systems. Its language slowly faded. Its political power was absorbed by empires. But its monuments remained. The pyramids still stood. The temples still whispered stories through stone. And the deserts still held secrets buried beneath shifting sand. Even today, archaeologists continue to uncover new discoveries: hidden tombs, unknown chambers, and artifacts that challenge what we thought we knew, as if Egypt is still quietly revealing itself, piece by piece, to anyone willing to listen. So when we look at ancient Egypt today, we are not just seeing a civilization that ended thousands of years ago. We are seeing a legacy that refused to disappear, a world built on belief, ambition, fear, and the dream of eternity. And maybe that is the greatest secret of all, that Egypt was never truly about pyramids or pharaohs. It was about humanity's oldest desire: to be remembered, to be eternal, to never truly fade away. And as our journey comes to an end, we are left with a quiet realization: the sands of Egypt may cover its cities, but they will never fully bury its story. And so we arrive at the final stretch of our journey, a place where history stops feeling like dates and dynasties and starts feeling like an echo, a quiet echo that still moves through the sands of Egypt today. Because even after thousands of years, ancient Egypt does not feel completely gone. It feels paused, like a story left unfinished, waiting for someone to continue reading it under the desert sky. But before we reach the end, we need to understand something important. Ancient Egypt did not collapse in a single moment. It did not fall like a statue being pushed over. It faded, slowly, quietly, like ink disappearing into water. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Life continued along the Nile as it always had. Farmers planted crops when the river rose. Temples still received offerings. Priests still whispered prayers to the gods. And pharaohs, at least in name, still ruled. But beneath this surface of continuity, something was changing. Power was no longer centered in one unshakable place. It was splitting between foreign influence and local tradition, between old beliefs and new ideas, between memory and reality. And as that balance weakened, Egypt began to feel less like a unified empire and more like a collection of inherited stories trying to hold themselves together. One by one, outside forces tightened their grip, not always violently, sometimes politically, sometimes culturally, and sometimes simply by being stronger, more organized, or more adaptable. Empires do not always destroy other empires, sometimes they simply replace them, and Egypt, once the center of ancient power and mystery, slowly became part of something larger than itself. But even as political control shifted, something remarkable remained unchanged: the identity of Egypt. Because even when rulers changed, the land itself did not forget. The Nile still flooded, the desert still stretched endlessly, and the pyramids still stood like silent witnesses to everything that had come before. Time could take power, time could take language, time could take kings, but time struggled to take stone. And so Egypt began to live two lives at once, one life in the present, and one life preserved in the past, a past that was becoming harder and harder to understand. As centuries passed, the old meanings of temples and symbols began to fade. What once was obvious became mysterious. What once was sacred became forgotten. Hieroglyphs turned into silent art rather than readable language. Temples became ruins rather than living spaces of worship. And the gods slowly became myths, not because they stopped being believed in overnight, but because belief itself changed shape. New religions spread across the region. New empires brought new ideas about life, death, and divinity. And gradually, the ancient Egyptian worldview, so deeply connected to balance, order, and eternal cycles, was replaced by different ways of understanding existence. Still, Egypt did not vanish. It transformed again, like it had done so many times before. Under Greek and later Roman influence, Egypt became something new, a cultural fusion, a meeting point between worlds. Its libraries, cities, and scholars continued to influence the wider Mediterranean world. Even in its later form, Egypt was not silent. It was evolving. But the original voice of ancient Egypt, the voice of the pharaohs, the old priests, the pyramid builders, was slowly becoming distant. And then it became memory. But memory has its own strange power, because even when a civilization disappears, its symbols remain, and symbols can survive longer than truth. Long after the last pharaoh ruled independently, Egypt continued to exist in the imagination of the world. Travelers came and stared at its monuments in confusion. How were they built? Why were they built? What kind of people could create something so massive, so precise, so enduring? The pyramids became questions carved into stone, questions with no easy answers. And that uncertainty gave Egypt a second life, a mythological life, a version of Egypt that grew larger in mystery as real understanding faded. Then came a moment that would change everything again, the rediscovery of ancient Egypt. Centuries passed where the original meaning of hieroglyphs was lost completely. They were seen as decorative symbols, not a language. But then, slowly, scholars began to unlock them again, piece by piece, letter by letter. A forgotten world started speaking once more. And when it did, the modern world realized something shocking. Ancient Egypt had not been a simple civilization of superstition and mystery. It had been incredibly advanced. Mathematics, engineering, medicine, governance, astronomy. A deeply structured society with knowledge that had survived millennia, hidden in plain sight. And suddenly, the pyramids were no longer just monuments. They were engineering mysteries. The temples were no longer just ruins. They were records of a sophisticated belief system. The tombs were no longer just burial sites. They were carefully constructed maps of the afterlife.
But even with all this knowledge restored, something still remains unknown, because Egypt is not a solved puzzle. It is still incomplete. There are chambers yet to be fully explored, texts yet to be fully understood, and artifacts that continue to challenge what historians believe is possible. Even today, new discoveries appear from beneath the sand, as if the land itself refuses to stop revealing its secrets. And maybe that is the most fitting legacy for Egypt, a civilization that never fully allows itself to be finished. But beyond archaeology and science, there is something deeper that keeps Egypt alive: its emotional power. Because when people look at the pyramids, they do not just see stone, they feel time. They feel distance. They feel something ancient and unreachable, yet strangely familiar. And that is because, at its core, ancient Egypt was never only about gods or kings or tombs. It was about a very human question. What happens when we are gone? How do we make sure we are not forgotten? The pharaohs tried to answer that question with pyramids, with gold, with names carved into eternal stone. But the real answer turned out to be something they may not have fully expected. They are remembered not because they conquered eternity, but because they tried to, and that effort alone was enough to preserve them. So as we reach the end of this journey, the deserts of Egypt grow quiet again. The temples stand still. The Nile continues its slow movement, as it always has. And beneath the sand, countless stories remain buried, waiting, not for resurrection, but for discovery. And perhaps the greatest truth of ancient Egypt is this: it is not a civilization that belongs only to the past. It is a civilization that still exists in fragments, in stone, in memory, in curiosity, and in every person who looks at those ancient monuments and feels, even for a moment, that time is not as simple as it seems. And so our journey ends here, not with an ending that closes Egypt forever, but with a silence that continues it, because some stories are not meant to finish. They are meant to echo forever.
As the years passed, the people of the kingdom slowly learned a painful truth. The greatest danger was not always an enemy army crossing the border or a foreign king demanding conquest. Sometimes the greatest danger sat quietly on the throne itself. The emperor had transformed his nation into a place where fear ruled more strongly than any law. Every street, every marketplace, and every palace corridor carried the invisible weight of suspicion. People became careful with every word they spoke. A simple joke about the ruler could lead to an investigation. A complaint about taxes could be interpreted as an act of rebellion. Even a whisper between friends became dangerous because nobody knew who might be listening. The emperor created a network of spies that stretched across the empire. Servants reported on their masters. Soldiers watched their fellow soldiers. Neighbors quietly informed against neighbors. The result was a society where trust slowly disappeared. Families avoided discussing politics at their own dinner tables. Friends who had known each other for decades began to keep secrets from one another. Fear had become a permanent resident in the empire. The emperor believed that absolute control would make him immortal. He built larger palaces, surrounded himself with luxury, and demanded ceremonies that reminded everyone of his power. When he entered a room, hundreds of people would bow their heads to the floor. His clothes were decorated with rare jewels. His halls were covered with expensive paintings and golden ornaments collected from every corner of his territory. To outsiders, the empire appeared magnificent. Travelers saw grand cities, enormous monuments, and an army that looked unstoppable. But behind the beautiful walls was a different reality. The farmers who produced the empire's food struggled under impossible taxes. The workers who constructed the emperor's monuments labored under harsh conditions. Many spent their entire lives building symbols of power that they would never be allowed to enjoy. History has repeatedly shown us this strange pattern. The most powerful rulers often tried to create monuments that would outlive them. They wanted future generations to remember their names forever. Some built temples. Some built statues. Others built entire cities. But stone and gold could never hide the suffering of ordinary people. The emperor continued his life surrounded by luxury while his people became poorer and more desperate. Eventually, small signs of resistance began to appear. A few brave citizens started sharing forbidden stories in secret. Some soldiers questioned whether their loyalty should belong to a man or to the nation itself. Officials inside the palace quietly wondered how long the emperor's rule could continue. Every dictatorship, no matter how powerful it appears, contains a weakness.
It depends on the fear of millions of people. And once enough people stop being afraid, even the strongest throne can begin to shake. The emperor, however, could not imagine a world where his authority would end. He believed his walls were high enough, his soldiers were loyal enough, his enemies were weak enough. Like many rulers before him, he confused silence with loyalty. He thought the quiet streets meant the people loved him, but in reality, they were simply waiting for a moment when fear would no longer control their lives. And that moment was approaching faster than anyone inside the palace realized. The empire that had once seemed eternal was beginning to crack from within, not because of a foreign invasion, not because of a natural disaster, but because one man's endless hunger for power had slowly destroyed the foundation of his own kingdom. The final chapter of his rule would become one of the greatest lessons in history, a reminder that a throne built on terror may stand for years, sometimes even decades, but it can never truly be secure, because every empire of fear carries the seed of its own destruction. And soon the emperor would discover that even the most terrifying king could not escape the judgment of history.